Today we will have the first talk, which is Innovations, Accomplishing Forgiveness Education in 30 Days, a report from the United States. And this is by Dr. Suzanne Freedman, or Suzanne, oh, she's not listening. Suzanne or Suzanne?
Suzanne.
Suzanne, okay.
Suzanne.
Again, apologies for mispronunciations. Dr. Suzanne Freedman is a professor in Educational Psychology Department at the University of Northern Iowa in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Her dissertation at the University of Wisconsin-Madison was a landmark study that was published in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology on forgiveness with incest survivors. Dr. Freedman's area of expertise include the psychology of interpersonal forgiveness, forgiveness education and intervention, moral development, incest and sexual abuse, eating disorders, early adolescent development, and at-risk adolescents. She has presented at numerous national and international conferences on the psychology of interpersonal forgiveness. Please welcome Dr. Freedman.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here this morning speaking to you about a forgiveness education research project that I did with at-risk adolescents several years ago. As many of you said, I am inspired by all the research that is being conducted with children and adolescents around the world. I don't think I've ever been in a room with so many people doing forgiveness education, so that is really exciting. Just a little bit of context about me. I started graduate school here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1987. I was here from 1987 to 1994, working with Dr. Enright, so I think I am like his oldest student. I hope you can forgive me if I go really fast, because 30 minutes is not very much time to talk about a research study, but I'm going to do my best. Just a few quotes to open up, and I think this reflects a lot of what we've been discussing in the conference so far. Susan David, the author of the book Emotional Agility, states, "How children navigate their emotional world is critical to their lifelong success." And I think forgiveness education and helping children decrease their anger really affects their emotional world immediately and in their future. Another quote by Bloom states, "We reenact our past everywhere, at home, at school, at the workplace, on the playground, in the streets. We cue each other to play roles in our personal dramas, secretly hoping that someone will give us a different script, a different outcome to the drama." Is forgiveness the different script? I think it is. Okay, sure. Okay, so I worked with at-risk adolescents attending an alternative school. These students were either kicked out of their traditional high school, at risk of dropping out, or they had already dropped out themselves. And the goal in working with these students is that I wanted to work with students who had anger issues and teach them a different way of responding to their anger and hurt feelings. And some quotes from students post-education illustrate the benefits for them learning about forgiveness. One student said, "I had never shared my hurt and anger before. Learning how to forgive and that it was an option was very beneficial for her." Another student said that they appreciated realizing that anger and obsessing over the offender is a waste of time. Another student said that they learned how to better communicate their feelings toward their dad. So most of the forgiveness education at the time I did this study had been conducted with adults. According to SIM, literature on forgiveness in the adolescent population was limited and inadequate. As a developmental psychologist, I wanted to work with students in school who were carrying around a great deal of anger and were cognitively and morally mature enough to understand forgiveness. For forgiveness to occur, individuals must be able to move beyond egocentrism and acknowledge the perspective of others. And although adolescents are developmentally prepared to give and receive forgiveness, this population really needs education about what it means to forgive and how to forgive. Enright, Santos, and Almabuck conducted a research study in 1989, and they developed a model of forgiveness and found that adolescents were stage 3 forgivers, meaning they were labeled expectational forgivers, and they were most likely to forgive when expectations of forgiveness were put on them. So teachers, religious leaders, authority figures, and peers can greatly impact teenagers' willingness and/or ability to forgive. Just to give a little background of the type of lives the adolescents in this study were experiencing. Almost all of the participants in this study had one of the following: a parent or relative or significant other in jail, a child or were pregnant, a parent or step-parent who was either a drug user, drug dealer, recovering alcoholic, or drug addict, were either physically, sexually, or emotionally abused by a parental figure, were experiencing some type of hurt by a parent or significant other, and if female, were involved in an abusive relationship with a man. Yesterday we talked about anger and its effects on individuals. We know that chronic anger interferes with students' ability to learn and may result in academic failure. Anger-related problems are among the most common reasons for referral to school counselors and mental health counselors. Anger issues often lead to cutting schools and increased absences. And anger causes increased violence and aggressive acts at school, on other students, and school personnel. When I was planning for this intervention, my initial ideas were based on previous research. I thought that I would do a 16-week intervention in which I would come to the school once a week for about 90 minutes for 16 sessions total and approximately 24 hours of education. My actual intervention looked a little different. The school wanted me to come every day for 7 weeks. For 4 days a week, the class duration was 42 minutes, and 1 day a week, it was 30 minutes. So the education consisted of 31 sessions total, between 30 and 42 minutes a session, for a 7-week duration. And that was approximately 23 hours of education. So the hours were almost exactly the same, whether it was over 16 weeks or 7 weeks. And I recently completed some forgiveness education with 3 classes of 5th graders, and I asked the teacher to give me some reflections at the end of the forgiveness education, and she wrote up some of her thoughts. And one quote she said that kind of speaks to the benefits of daily forgiveness education was, "I feel the lessons were sometimes too far apart, so it was difficult to put past learning into play. 2 lessons a week for a shorter amount of time may have worked better." So that was, I did once a week in the classroom, and she commented that more frequent lessons may have been better for the students. So benefits of the daily forgiveness education: with daily lessons, students were able to recall the information from one day to the next. Students and the educator, myself, were able to get to know each other more easily and form a trusted relationship in less time. And I know some of the forgiveness education that's being done by all of you, you are the classroom teachers, so you know the students better. But as an outsider, as the researcher coming in, when I started the forgiveness education, I didn't know the students. So it was easier to get to know them when I was coming every day compared to once a week. The time on task and focus was better with daily lessons. And of course, the reason I did it was because it worked best with the school schedule. The goal of the forgiveness education initially was to help adolescents forgive someone who had hurt them deeply. But because of the shorter duration in terms of weeks, the goal became to make the decision to consider forgiveness as an alternative to revenge. And I was hoping that students would make the commitment to forgive one's offender eventually, if they didn't feel ready to do so at the end of the intervention. However, as you'll see when we discuss results, most of the students greatly improved and increased their forgiveness towards the offender who had hurt them deeply. To talk a little bit about methodology, I worked with the school counselor and administrator in determining a screening survey that included 5 questions that asked students if they had experienced a deep hurt. If so, were they still negatively impacted by that hurt? How they were impacted? And would they like to be a part of a class that helped them move beyond the effects of their hurt? I didn't mention the word forgiveness in the screening survey, as I didn't want to bias students' thoughts and feelings about forgiveness, because I was going to give them a forgiveness assessment if they were part of the intervention. 24 students met criteria. Another criteria that the school wanted was that students had to have a grade point average of 3.0 or better. Out of the 24 students, they were randomly divided into the forgiveness education class, which was the experimental group, and the personal communications class, which was the control group. I had a co-teacher for the forgiveness education class, and the personal communications class, the co-teacher was the main teacher, and I helped out in that class. I was the main teacher for the forgiveness education class. In terms of the experimental group, we started out with 12 subjects. 2 participants, 2 students ended up dropping out for personal reasons, so we had 10 subjects in the experimental group. All of them were female, 8 Caucasian, 2 Hispanic. The age range was 15 to 19 years old with an average age of 17.2 years. 3 students were in 10th grade, 4 students were in 11th, and 3 were seniors. In the personal communication class, 1 student dropped out for personal reasons, so we had a total of 11 participants, 9 females and 2 males. For the females, 6 were Caucasian, 3 were African American. For the males, both of them were Caucasian. The age range was 16 to 19 with an average age of 17.4 years. And 2 students were in 10th grade, 4 were in 11th, and 5 were seniors. So pretty similar between the 2 classes. What I found out from initial meetings with students were that the adolescents had a lot of misconceptions about forgiveness as well as skepticism. And that's why I think it's so important to educate children, adolescents, adults about forgiveness. Because if misconceptions are holding them back from forgiving, we really need to clear up those misconceptions. And Gasson, a fellow graduate student of mine, explains that given the moral betrayal involved in the types of offenses some adolescents experience, along with the adolescents' developing concept of justice, it's not surprising that adolescents hold a lot of anger and hurt toward their offender. You'll see when I describe the hurts that these adolescents experienced, they're really severe. And it makes sense that they are angry about what has happened to them. Adolescents felt ambivalent about the idea of forgiveness, and they equated forgiveness with absolving the offender, with reconciliation, and they didn't recognize the role of anger in the forgiveness process. In terms of hurts that students experienced in the experimental group, 6 students reported experiencing a great deal of hurt, 3 students reported much hurt, and 1 student said they experienced some hurt. I listed the hurts reported by the students. 1 student reported being sexually abused by her uncle from the age 4 to 11. Another student said their parents divorced and most of the blame was pointed at her. Another student said, "Dad told me he did not love me and did not want anything to do with me. He disowned me." 1 student was raped by 3 men and got pregnant. Another student, their boyfriend lied to her and cheated on her. Another student reported that my boyfriend puts me down and calls me names. Control group participants experienced similar hurts in terms of severity. 6 students reported experiencing a great deal of hurt. 4 students reported much hurt, and 1 student said some hurt. 1 student, a male, said he slept with someone who was HIV positive and was not told about it. Another student said her stepmom treats her very unfairly, does everything possible to get rid of me and keep me away from my mom. She steals from me and her kids steal my clothes. Another student said, my baby's father told me he did not want to be in our lives anymore. He did not want to call a mistake his child. Another student reported that their boyfriend cheated on them and she fought the girl. 2 students had parents in prison. 1 student said, my mom got into drugs and went to prison a few times. Another student said, when I was 13, my mom went to jail for 4 years and my dad and grandma took care of us. So these are pretty deep hurts. In terms of instruments, I heard yesterday someone say they'd like more information on assessments that were used to evaluate the results of the study. The Enright Forgiveness Inventory was used to assess forgiveness. At the time I used it, it was called the Attitude Scale. It was a 60-item scale used to measure the degree to which the person had forgiven their offender. Each participant was asked to consider the one who offended him or her and rate that person on the basis of one's current emotions. There were 20 items assessing positive and negative feelings, and 20 items assessing positive and negative cognitions held by the individual, and 20 items assessing positive and negative behaviors. On this scale, students were also asked to report who the offender was and the type of hurt they experienced. Sample items, and a sample item of an absence of negative emotions. I do not feel bitter toward the person. A sample item of an absence of negative cognition. I do not view the person as below me. And an example of a presence of positive emotions was, I feel close to the person. Other instruments included the state trait anxiety to measure both state and trait anxiety. I used the Reynolds Adolescent Depression Scale to assess depression. I used the Cooper-Smith Self-Esteem Inventory, which is a 25-item scale to assess self-esteem, and the HOPE scale, developed by Enright and Almabook, assessed optimism toward the future in areas of parental relationships, friendship, achievement, and affect. These same assessments were given at post-test at the end of the intervention, and I also used a post-intervention individual interview that included assessment of whether forgiveness occurred. I asked students what they appreciated about the forgiveness education, what they learned from the forgiveness education, what they wished had been different about the forgiveness education. And we'll talk about that when I discuss results. The intervention procedure, there were 3 days of pre-testing in the group setting at first. I did 1 day of introductory icebreaker exercises. The intervention was based on Enright's 2001 20-unit process model of forgiveness that Dr. Enright discussed yesterday in the guided reflection. However, I modified it developmentally for adolescents. All the participants were given the book, Forgiveness is a Choice, written by Dr. Enright, that discusses and works the individual through all the 20 units in the model. What was interesting about this is that the students at the school didn't do a lot of homework. They had chaotic lives, they had busy lives, and we read a little bit of the book during the education, but I also asked them to read it for homework. And a few of the students did, but most of the students were honest and reported to me that they didn't read the book. But what they said was that their family members read the book, specifically their parents picked up the book and were reading it. And that's why yesterday in our breakout session, I talked about what I'd love to see more of is when we do forgiveness education with children and adolescents, also doing some forgiveness education with their parents. So what the students are learning at home could be reinforced at home. And I think a lot of parents have misconceptions about what forgiveness is and isn't, and could benefit from learning accurate ideas about forgiveness to heal their own hurts. The forgiveness education was loosely based on a curriculum developed by Enright and the Human Development Study Group in 1991 and used in a previous study, Forgiveness Within the Family. I divided the process model into 5 different lessons. Lesson 1 was Anger to Hope. Lesson 2 was Decide to Forgive. Lesson 3 was See with New Eyes. Lesson 4 was Soften Your Heart. And lesson 5 was Soak Up the Pain. I'll give a little details of the lessons now. The lessons were accomplished by didactic instruction, both small and large group discussion. I had students pair and share. We did activities about anger and how students usually respond to anger, the ways they had been previously coping with their hurt. We talked about future goals and where students wanted to be in 5 and 10 years. I had students do some reflective writing and journaling. We talked about what students liked about themselves. They talked about, they wrote about their shame. They wrote about self-esteem, as many students had low self-esteem. We watched the film Dead Man Walking. We read the Dr. Seuss book, Horton Hears a Who. We read 2 case studies in class that illustrates illustrated the units in the forgiveness model and was relatable to students. And we also watched a video clip from Dateline illustrating a woman who forgave the man who had killed her husband and 16-year-old daughter in a drunk driving accident. It was a very powerful clip because the woman was able to forgive this man, and they went around to schools and talked about the dangers of drinking and driving, as well as the benefits of forgiveness. The first lesson was anger to hope, and this lesson involved identifying the destructive nature of prolonged anger and really encouraged the participants to do something constructive with their pain and anger. Students spent a lot of time discussing anger and its role in the forgiveness process. Students benefited by learning how to take care of their anger, and as one student put it, that anger is a normal and natural feeling. They expressed feelings related to being hurt and coping mechanisms used to deal with their hurt. And this was really one of the first times that students were learning that it was okay to feel the pain of their injuries. They had used a lot of defense mechanisms to protect themselves from feeling their pain. So this was new to students and a little bit scary to make themselves so vulnerable. An example of a specific activity that helped students recognize their feelings was brainstorming the feelings associated with what they had experienced and how they had been coping so far, to really have them reflect on the way they felt about their injury. And as Fitzgibbons explains, significant numbers of people in our society do not know how to appropriately deal with their anger. Just a quote that reflects this. Knowing that one has the strength and courage to face their pain and move forward was very powerful for the students. As stated in a blog post by Cecil Murphy, as we allow ourselves to feel the pain, our hearts will begin to heal. So really, we have to allow ourselves to feel the pain before we can begin to consider forgiveness. Another quote is, unfortunately, society does not offer healthy messages about how to express and cope with one's anger. What we often see and hear are messages portraying anger as an inappropriate emotion, and alternately, someone exploding and acting violent and aggressive due to their anger. Jennifer Kaufman was one of the Boston Marathon bomb survivors, describes how she was raised to believe that anger is unacceptable. She states, "I grew up being told that anger is a bad emotion and something to avoid. I would get a consequence for getting angry." Kaufman goes on to say that she stuffed her anger until the bomb went off. As discussed with Melissa Monti in the Mind Love podcast, it is important to be a witness to one's anger. If we can be with it and let it pass through us, then we can let other emotions in, such as compassion and empathy. Helping students deal with their anger in a healthy way is such an important component of the forgiveness process model. Knowing that they can do something with their anger gave students hope for the future. One student remarked that working on the process of forgiveness gave her hope for a better life than her mother had. This student listed the following advantages as giving up anger and other uncomfortable feelings. She said she had an improved mood, physical well-being, and basic outlook on life improved. She had better relationships, increased inner peace, emotional maturity, and decreased anxiety and fear. Talking about the feelings in class helps students process them without becoming overwhelmed. One student remarked how good it felt to let go of her negative feelings. She described the process as a wall that had been built around her, gradually coming down brick by brick. The next phase lesson was an introduction of forgiveness and what forgiveness is and is not. The definition of forgiveness comes from Dr. Enright's book, When Unjustly Hurt by Another, We Forgive When We Overcome the Resentment Toward the Offender, not by denying our right to the resentment, but instead by trying to offer the wrongdoer compassion, benevolence, sometimes love, and as we give these, we as forgivers realize that the offender does not necessarily have a right or deserve such gifts. A definition more easily used with the students was, forgiveness is the decrease of negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors directed at an offender, and perhaps over time, developing more positive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors towards an offender. So when we discussed what forgiveness is and is not, there was an emphasis on distinguishing between forgiveness and reconciliation. We also communicated that forgiveness is not forgetting. These deep hurts are not easily forgotten. The idea that one does not have to receive an apology to be able to forgive generated a lot of discussion and was helpful for the students, as was the idea that justice can occur alongside forgiveness. The students appreciated hearing that their offenders can be held accountable while they work on forgiveness personally. That was important to them. Forgiveness was presented as one way to end destructive anger, and we encouraged participants to consider forgiveness as an option. The lesson also called for the forswearing of revenge. This was a little bit of problematic for students who were used to living a life by the motto, an eye for an eye. Students had been schooled by their parents. They told me this: don't start anything, but if someone starts with you, definitely get back at them. So their parents were not preaching forgiveness or showing kindness to people who are not kind to them. Prior to reviewing the four phases in Enright's 20-unit model, I had students develop their own model of forgiveness. I asked them to talk about and write how they thought forgiveness occurred based on what they had previously learned, and that was really interesting. Students were very surprised to learn that the process of forgiveness had so many steps, and they really appreciated learning that forgiveness is a choice and something that took effort and time and courage, that it wasn't something that happened overnight. The following quote, attributed to Viktor Frankl, also reflects the idea that one has the power to choose how to respond to circumstances. Between stimulus and response lies a space. In that space lie our freedom and power to choose a response. In our response lies our growth and happiness. A quote that from Linda Sanford talks about, we can't control what happens to us as children or in life, but we can control how we respond to these events. And telling students that they have the choice to forgive and do something different with their anger was very powerful. Knowing what forgiveness was and was not helps students want to learn more about forgiveness and make the decision to forgive. All right, I got the 5-minute warning, so I am moving on. In this lesson, lesson 3 was seeing with new eyes. The focus turned towards reframing one's perception of the offender as a human being rather than the person who simply committed the offense. After being deeply hurt, we have a tendency to view the person as a monster. We forget any other characteristics that we may have known about them. So this lesson encouraged participants to see their offender as part of a more complete picture, to see the vulnerabilities in their offender that may have led to the offense, not to excuse the offender, as Dr. Enright said yesterday, but to better understand them, maybe understand the context, maybe understand that they had been abused as a child, and that may have influenced their behavior. We discussed the concepts of unconditionality, the understanding that all persons are equal at some level. We also talked about inherent worth, that people are worthy and deserve respect regardless of their actions. These two concepts were difficult for students. You heard the deep hurts that they experienced, and thinking that the person who hurt them was just as worthy and important as they are, and that they should show respect to their offender was difficult. Lesson 4 was soften your heart. Based on the reframing that we had done and looking at their offender in a new way, we talked about empathizing with the offender, showing empathy to that person, putting yourself in their shoes, and understanding his or her own pain. The goal was to feel compassion for the offender and work towards decreasing negative feelings. These were some of the hardest units in the process. Lesson 5 was soaking up the pain, and this taught participants to absorb the pain rather than pass it on to others. This lesson often also emphasized the gift-like quality, and students really realized that by absorbing the pain, they could stop their hurt from negatively affecting other people, their partners, their children, their friends. Results. Statistical significance was demonstrated on all the measures except self-esteem. The experimental group significantly increased in forgiveness toward the offender and feelings of hope compared to the control group. There was a greater reduction in anxiety, and both state anxiety, trait anxiety, and depression. Don't have time to go over this, but if you look at the Enright Forgiveness Inventory, even though the goal changed, students increased 100 points on the Enright Forgiveness Inventory. The effect sizes were rather large. For forgiveness, it was 1.83. Anxiety, 1.58. Depression was 1.39. Students were asked, is forgiveness a goal for you? All 10 students in the forgiveness education group reported that forgiveness was a goal for them post-intervention. Students were asked, what has been the most helpful in the course for you? 7 students reported that learning about the negative effects of anger and how to let go of anger was most helpful. 3 students mentioned perspective taking and putting themselves in their offender's shoes. 4 students shared that gaining a better understanding of forgiveness and learning about forgiveness as an option was helpful. 2 students reported enjoying reading the book Forgiveness as a Choice. Conceptual knowledge and understanding increased as a result of forgiveness. Students' definitions of forgiveness changed. They understood that forgiveness included decreasing anger, and that anger, working through anger, was a part of the forgiveness model, that one doesn't need an apology to forgive, that forgiveness does not automatically lead to reconciliation, and that forgiveness benefits the forgiver as well as the offender. Just a few quotes. Before class, a student said, I hated the injured and men in general. Now I'm not so angry and close to forgiving. I learned ways to relieve anger instead of doing what I did before. Hopefully the PowerPoint can be shared with participants, so I'm just going to go. You'll be able to see that the study did include some limitations. Going to math class after talking about their deep hurts was hard for students. The forgiveness education was in the middle of the day. One major limitation, that some students were still being hurt. They weren't separated from the offender. Children and adolescents cannot always be removed from the hurt. And that was difficult. It's difficult to forgive if you're still being hurt by the person or any other person. It's not possible to forgive, like I said. Ideally, you want some time since the last abusive incident. The sample size was small. I was the only forgiveness educator. It's best to do forgiveness education with multiple educators so that we know that the forgiveness is what's effective, not the personality characteristics of the educator. Some students were influenced by others. When you do group work, students who were maybe not as excited about forgiveness might have influenced other students. You also have to go at the pace of not everybody's pace. So that was difficult. And lastly, conclusions. Results illustrate how forgiveness education may be beneficial for at-risk adolescents as well as other children and adolescents. Students in my college class on interpersonal forgiveness frequently remarked that they wish they had learned about forgiveness earlier in their life. This study illustrated that forgiveness education was effective in increasing forgiveness toward an offender and increasing psychological well-being for this population. Results are encouraging and need to be replicated with additional populations of adolescents using different intervention designs and forgiveness education curriculum. Giving children and adolescents opportunities to think about forgiveness is beneficial. Reflection will allow a deeper understanding of forgiveness to develop. Adolescents need to know that forgiveness is an option. Adolescents need to be educated about forgiveness and how it is in their power to choose to forgive. Okay, thank you very much. Please forgive me for going over.